I had 30 years of practice at that table. 30 years of sitting quietly while Victoria held court at the head of it. 30 years of complimenting food I had cooked, and watching her accept the compliments, as if the kitchen had simply produced the meal out of reverence for her presence. 30 years of smiling at the jokes made at my expense, dressed up as warmth. 30 years of David's hand on my arm, under the table, not comfort, management. The gentle pressure that said, not now, not here, let it go. I let it go. Every year, for 30 years I let it go. I did not let it go on that Thanksgiving. My name is Caroline Merritt. I am 55 years old. I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, the daughter of a man named Harold who ran a small but steady insurance business, and who believed in plain dealing and decent behavior, and the kind of grace that does not require an audience to be real. My father raised me to be polite. He also raised me to pay attention. He said those two things were not in conflict. He said you could be polite to a person and still see them clearly. He said seeing clearly was never impolite. I saw Victoria clearly from the first dinner. I was 24 years old, and David had brought me to his mother's house in Buckhead for what she called a proper introduction, and what I understood, even then, to be an audition. Victoria Merritt was 60 at the time, silver-haired and immaculate. The kind of woman who has practiced gracious condescension for so long that she no longer distinguishes it from actual grace. She looked at me across the dinner table with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and she asked me, with enormous warmth, what my family did. I told her my father ran an insurance business in Knoxville. She said how lovely in a tone that meant how insufficient, and she moved on to the next subject. David, sitting beside me, did not say anything. He poured more wine, and he talked to his cousin across the table, and I sat with the how lovely, and I saw clearly what the next 30 years were going to require of me if I married this man. I married him anyway. I loved him. He was not Victoria. He was his own person in the ways that mattered when we were alone. He was funny and kind, and he listened to me in the specific way that makes a person feel worth listening to. I believed the private version of David was the real one, and that the public version, the version that became compliant and small in his mother's presence, was a temporary thing that would eventually resolve. It did not resolve. In 30 years, it did not resolve. Victoria remained Victoria, and David remained the man who could not disappoint his mother, no matter the cost to his wife. And I remained the woman at that table, managing the gap between what I had been promised and what I had received. I managed it with politeness. I managed it with the specific patience of a woman who believed, for a very long time, that the situation could be outlasted if she was simply steady enough. Then my father died. And then I found the emails. And then I stopped being patient. My father Harold died in March of the same year as the Thanksgiving. He was 8. He had been declining for 2 years, and his death was not a surprise, and it was still the worst thing that had happened to me in my adult life, because Harold had been the person who saw me most clearly and most generously, and whose seeing had been the ground I stood on whether I knew it or not. He left me well provided for. Harold had been careful with money his whole life in the way of a man who grew up without it, and understood its meaning, and treated it with respect rather than display. The insurance business had done better than it looked like it was doing because Harold had reinvested quietly for decades. There was a significant amount in accounts. There was a piece of land outside Knoxville that had appreciated considerably. There was a sum that surprised me and that I did not discuss with anyone, including David, because Harold had always said that what you have is your own business until you decide to make it someone else's, and I was not ready to decide that yet. I was not ready because my father had just died, and I was grieving, and the grief had a quality that I could not fully describe, except to say that it was the grief of losing the last person who was entirely in my corner. Victoria had always made clear that I was a guest in her son's life, rather than a member of his family. David, in 30 years, had never fully contradicted this. My friends were good friends, but they had their own lives and their own corners to tend. Harold had been the corner that was entirely mine. I took the summer to grieve. I did not do anything about the inheritance except put it in accounts in my name and let it sit. I did not discuss it with David in specific terms. He knew my father had left me something. He did not know the extent. I did not feel ready to share the extent, and I told myself this was normal grief, caution, and not a premonition. It was a premonition. I just did not know it yet. I found the emails in September. David had left his tablet open on his desk in the study when he went to a site visit. I was looking for a utility bill that I thought I had put in the desk drawer. The tablet was open to his email. I did not intend to read his email. His email was visible on the screen, and the subject line of the most recent message from his mother was the one that stopped my hand. The subject line said Caroline's inheritance. That was all. 2 words and an apostrophe and my name. I sat down in the desk chair. I opened the thread. I am going to tell you what was in those emails because the specifics matter. Victoria's tone and David's tone and the specific language they used. The words are important. Not for drama. Because the words are what told me who these people actually were after 30 years of a different performance. Victoria had written, "David, this situation needs to move faster. Your father-in-law's estate is more than we thought. The land alone could solve everything. That woman has no idea what she has or how to manage it. She signs whatever you put in front of her without reading it. Get the foundation documents prepared. The lawyer needs to have it done before the end of the year, or the whole thing becomes impossible. I cannot face another club renewal with this hanging over me." David had written back, "I know, I'm working on it. She doesn't suspect anything. I'll have the documents ready by October. Give me until Thanksgiving to have her signature." There were 14 more messages in the thread. I read all of them. The picture they assembled was this. Victoria's family money, the money she had been presenting for 30 years as the foundation of the merit, name, and position, was gone. Not diminished, gone. A series of bad investments and a lawsuit settlement that had not been disclosed to anyone had wiped it out over the previous decade. She had been maintaining the appearance of wealth on credit and careful social management, and the terror of being found out had been consuming her for years. My father's death had presented a solution. His estate was substantial. If that estate could be moved into a family foundation that David and Victoria controlled, the foundation would have real assets. The foundation would provide a respectable explanation for the family's financial situation. And Victoria could maintain her position in the social world she had been living in on borrowed time. The Caroline in those emails was a useful instrument. She signs whatever you put in front of her without reading it. She doesn't suspect anything. Get her signature by Thanksgiving. I had signed things David had put in front of me, not carelessly. I trusted my husband. I had read what he gave me to read, and I had signed what he explained to me, and I had not gone looking beneath the explanation because I trusted him. That woman has no idea what she has or how to manage it. I sat in David's desk chair for 45 minutes. Then I took my phone and I photographed every email in the thread. I photographed the other documents I found in the folder attached to the most recent message, which included an early draft of the foundation articles and a memo from an attorney that outlined the proposed asset transfer. I put the phone in my pocket. I put the tablet back exactly where David had left it. I went to the kitchen and I made a cup of tea, and I sat at the kitchen table and I drank it. I did not cry. I had cried the whole summer for my father. I did not have crying left for this. What I had was clarity. The specific cold clarity of a woman who has just been handed the complete picture after 30 years of seeing only parts of it. Victoria had never respected me. That was not new. What was new was understanding that David had not simply failed to protect me from his mother. He had been partnering with her. He had been managing me. He had been planning to take something that my father had worked his whole life to leave me, and give it to a woman who had written that I was too foolish to know what I had. I finished my tea. I rinsed the cup. I went to my home office and I started planning. I did not rush. Rushing was how people made the mistakes that cost them the thing they were protecting. I had watched Victoria make social moves for 30 years, and the one quality she had that I genuinely respected was patience. She waited for the right moment. She chose her terrain. She never moved until she was certain. I was going to choose my terrain, and I was going to wait for the right moment, and I was going to be certain. The terrain chose itself. The last Thursday in November. Victoria's house in Buckhead. The Merritt family Thanksgiving, which was the social event of her year, and which she staged with the specific grandiosity of a woman performing a version of herself that cost more than she had. 30 people at a table in a dining room designed to impress. The family's attorneys and their spouses. The cousins and the aunts, and the old friends from the club that she could not afford to rejoin. The entire audience of her performance, assembled in one room. In that room, in front of all of those people, the performance was going to end. I spent the weeks between September and November preparing, not emotionally, practically. I went to my own attorney, a woman named Patricia Crane who had done estate work in Atlanta for 20 years and who had been recommended to me by a friend with the specific assessment that Patricia did not take nonsense from anyone. I showed Patricia the emails and the foundation documents. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You have married a very foolish man." I said, "I know." She said, "He is also probably a fraudulent one, depending on how far this has progressed." I said, "I know." She said, "What do you want to do?" I told her what I wanted to do. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "All right then, let's make sure it holds." We spent 6 weeks making sure it held. Patricia filed what needed to be filed, and froze what needed to be frozen, and prepared what needed to be prepared. My father's estate was secured in a way that David and Victoria's plan could not reach. I also spent those 6 weeks printing things. The email thread in full. The foundation draft. Victoria's attorney's memo. The financial records that Patricia had obtained through proper channels, showing the actual state of Victoria's accounts, organized, dated, flagged with tabs at the significant sections. I put them in folders, red folders. I tied each one with a ribbon the same shade of red. I made 30 of them, one for each seat at Victoria's Thanksgiving table. I will tell you about the drive to Buckhead. I drove myself. David had gone early to help with setup, which was the arrangement every year, and I had told him I would follow later. I wore the dark green dress that I had bought for the occasion, because it was the most elegant thing I owned, and because I wanted to look, when it happened, like a woman who had dressed for something important. I carried the folders in 2 shopping bags in the trunk. They made a satisfying sound when the bag shifted. Solid, real. 30 pieces of the truth in red folders with ribbons. Which is not how truth usually comes wrapped, but which seemed appropriate for the occasion. Victoria's house in Buckhead is the kind of house that announces itself before you arrive at it. The driveway is long and lined with trees that have been there since before she was born. The house itself is federal style, white columns, the particular grandeur of old Southern money that had not been old Southern money for quite some time. The valets were parking cars. The windows were lit from inside. Through the dining room windows, I could see the table already set, the candles already lit. I gave the valet my car. I carried the shopping bags myself. He offered to take them, and I said no thank you. These are for the table. Inside, the noise of 30 people who had been told this was a celebration, and who had no reason not to believe it. Victoria at the far end of the room, already holding court. Already in the particular posture that she inhabited at these events. Shoulders back, chin at the angle that said she was the most important person in the room, and she knew it, and she was graciously tolerating everyone else's presence. She saw me come in. She did not come toward me. She received me from a distance with a nod that said, "You are here, adequate. Welcome to the occasion I have created." I nodded back. I put the shopping bags in the coat room, and I went to find David. David was in the kitchen asking about the timing of the second course. He turned when I came in, and he came to kiss me, and he said, "You look beautiful," and I said thank you, and I looked at his face, and I thought about the email that said she doesn't suspect anything, and I said I have some things in the coat room that I will need help distributing later. He said, "Of course. What things?" I said, "Party favors." I said I wanted to do something special for the table this year. He said Victoria will love that. I said I think the whole table will find them interesting. He went back to talking about the second course, and I went to the dining room to find my seat. Dinner was what Thanksgiving at Victoria's was always. The food was extensive and it was good because I had cooked most of it, and Victoria's cook had made the rest of it according to instructions. Victoria sat at the head of the table. David sat at the far end. I sat in the middle, which was where I had always sat, visible enough to be addressed when necessary, not prominent enough to be centered. Victoria made her usual remarks about the sweet potatoes. She said they were slightly different from last year. She said this in a way that was not a compliment. I said I had tried a new preparation. She said she preferred the old one. The table moved on. The champagne was poured. The family attorney made a toast about gratitude and tradition, and the enduring strength of the Merritt family. Everyone drank. Victoria accepted the toast with the expression of a woman accepting her due. I waited until the second course plates had been cleared. I stood up. The table went slightly quiet, the way tables go quiet when someone stands who is not expected to stand. I picked up my champagne glass and I touched the rim with my spoon, and the sound cut through the remaining noise. Everyone turned. I said I would like to say a few words, if I may. I said Thanksgiving is a time for honesty. I said I have been thinking about honesty a great deal this fall, and I have something I want to share with everyone here. David was looking at me from the far end of the table. Something was moving behind his eyes. Not understanding yet. The edge of concern. I said this year, for the first time in 30 years, I finally understand the true nature of the family I married into. I said I want to share that understanding with all of you, because I think you deserve to have it. Then I went to the coat room. I picked up the shopping bags. I came back to the dining room. I began distributing the red folders. I started with Victoria. I set her folder in front of her with both hands. I said, "Happy Thanksgiving, Victoria." She looked at the folder and then at me, and I saw the first moment of something behind her eyes that was not confidence. I went around the table. Every seat. Every cousin and aunt and family friend and attorney's spouse. The red folders with the red ribbons. I set one at each place and I said Happy Thanksgiving each time, and I kept my voice entirely pleasant, because pleasantness is a choice and I had made mine. When I got back to my own seat, I remained standing. The table was silent. 30 people with red folders in front of them. I said, "You may open them whenever you are ready." For a moment, no one moved. Then the attorney's wife, a woman named Betsy, who I had always liked because she was the only person in that room who ever asked me genuine questions about my own life, opened hers. She read the first page. She looked up at me. She looked back down. That movement, one person opening one folder, broke the stillness. The room began to rustle with the sound of 30 folders being opened. David said Caroline, just my name, in a voice that was trying to project authority and was doing neither. I said, "Let me read you a few highlights." I said it pleasantly. I had been pleasant all evening, and I was going to remain pleasant because pleasantness, as I said, is a choice. I picked up my own folder. I had marked the passages I intended to read. I cleared my throat. I read Victoria's email about me not knowing how to manage what I had. I read the part about signing things without reading them. I read the part about the club and being humiliated. I read it in my own voice, clearly and at a volume suited to the size of the room, without editorializing, because the words did not require editorial assistance. The room was very quiet. I read David's response. "I'm working on it. She doesn't suspect anything. Give me until Thanksgiving." I said that is today. I said, in case anyone is wondering. I looked at David when I said it. He had gone a color that I had not seen on his face in 30 years. Victoria said my name. In a sharp voice. The voice she had always used to indicate that I had stepped outside the acceptable territory of my role. I turned to look at her. I said, "I am not finished, Victoria," in the same pleasant tone. I said, "There is something in the folder marked with a yellow tab on page 4 that I think the attorneys in the room will find particularly interesting." One of the attorneys had already found it. He was looking at it with the expression of someone reading something he wishes he had not been given to read. Victoria said, "This is absolutely outrageous." I said I agree. I said it has been outrageous for quite some time. I turned to page 7 of my folder. I said I would also like to address the financial situation, since it appears in these documents that the Merritt family's legendary resources are somewhat less legendary than previously represented. Someone at the far end of the table said what? I read the relevant sections, the investment losses, the lawsuit settlement, the actual balance of accounts that bore the Merritt name, the credit arrangements that had been sustaining the appearance of wealth. The dining room had the quality of a room where all the air has been changed for something else. People were reading their folders and looking at each other and looking at me and looking at Victoria. Victoria said, "My heart." I looked at her. She had brought her hand to her chest. Her color had changed. I said, "Victoria, I have watched you perform that particular maneuver several times over 30 years, and I want you to know that the promulence will take about 12 minutes to arrive, and in the meantime there are 2 attorneys and a cardiologist in this room who can assess whether you actually need one." She blinked, her hand lowered slightly. David said, "Caroline, please." I turned to look at my husband. He was standing now, at the far end of the table, and he looked like a man who has been standing on ground he believed was solid, and has just understood that the ground was always an illusion. I said, "David, I have let you put your hand on my arm at this table for 30 years to keep me quiet." I said, "Sit down." He sat down. I picked up my purse from the back of my chair. I picked up my folder. I set the folder back on the table because I did not need it anymore. I had said what I had come to say. I said to the room, "My attorney's name is Patricia Crane, and her office will be sending correspondence to the relevant parties beginning Monday morning." I said the foundation documents that some of you have just seen were never executed because the assets in question are fully secured. I said I suggest that anyone with a professional relationship to the Merritt family review the documents in those folders carefully before proceeding with any further business arrangements. I looked at Victoria one more time. She was not performing a cardiac event anymore. She was sitting at the head of her table, with her hand in her lap, and 30 of her family members and associates reading documents that described who she actually was. I said, "I am grateful for 30 years of clarity, Victoria." I said, "I finally have it." Then I walked to the hallway. I took my coat from the coat room. I walked through the front door of the house. The valet brought my car. I drove out the long driveway lined with trees that had been there since before Victoria was born, and would be there long after she was gone. I drove back toward Atlanta in the dark. I did not look back. Monday morning, Patricia filed the divorce petition. She also filed a fraud complaint with the Georgia Bar regarding the attorney who had drafted the foundation documents. He cooperated fully within the week, which suggested he had understood the situation he was in. David called me 17 times between Thanksgiving and Monday. I did not answer. On Monday evening he came to the house. I was not there. Patricia had advised me to stay elsewhere for the period immediately following the filing, and I had followed the advice. He left a message. He said we needed to talk. He said he knew he had made mistakes. He said his mother had put him in an impossible position. He said he still loved me. He said, "Please call me." I listened to the message twice. Then I saved it. Not for sentiment. Patricia said, "Save everything." The divorce was finalized the following spring. The settlement was the one Patricia had built, which reflected 30 years of a woman's contribution to a marriage and the specific circumstances of the attempted fraud. It was fair in the way that fair things are fair. Not pleasant, but accurate. Victoria did not attend any of the proceedings. Her health, I was told, had become genuinely precarious in the months following Thanksgiving, though whether this was related to the events of that evening or to other factors I did not attempt to determine. I sent her a card on her birthday in February. The card said, "I hope you are well." I meant it. I am not a person who wishes people ill. I am a person who wishes them to be exactly what they are in front of exactly the people who have been operating under different assumptions. She was exactly what she was. In front of exactly the right people. That was enough. I live in Knoxville now. Not the house I grew up in. An apartment on the north side, with good light and a view of the river from the bedroom window. I moved here because Knoxville is where my father lived and where I grew up and where the ground feels most like the ground my father helped me stand on. Being back here does not bring him back. It just puts me in the place where his presence is most available. I go to the land sometimes. The piece of land outside the city that he left me, the piece that had appreciated considerably and that Victoria had believed would solve everything. It is wooded. There is a creek. There are deer sometimes in the mornings. I have not decided what to do with it. I am in no hurry to decide. Harold would say, take your time. He would say the land has been there a long time and it will be there until you know what you want. He would say don't let anyone rush you into a decision about something that is yours. Nobody rushes me now. That is the change that 30 years of that table did not prepare me to understand how much I needed. Nobody puts their hand on my arm to indicate that I should be quieter. Nobody manages my presence in a room. Nobody tells me that the thing I have just been insulted by is not worth noticing because the person who did it is old, or tired, or under stress. I notice things. Harold raised me to notice things. I spent 30 years noticing things and then practicing not noticing because the noticing was inconvenient. I am done with the not noticing. I notice things and I say what I see, and I take the time I need to make the decisions that are mine to make. That is the whole life now. It sounds simple. It is the most complicated thing I have ever built, and the most straightforwardly mine. My name is Caroline Merritt. My father's name was Harold. He raised me to see clearly and to be polite, and he told me those two things were not in conflict. He was right. He was usually right. I set 30 red folders on a Thanksgiving table, and I read the truth out loud in a voice that did not shake. That was polite. That was very polite. That was the most polite thing I have ever done. The truth, after all, is the politest gift a person can offer, especially to people who have forgotten that it exists. I want to tell you what 30 years at Victoria's table actually looked like, because the Thanksgiving moment makes sense only if you understand what it was the conclusion of. The first Thanksgiving I attended was the year David and I got engaged. I was 26. I had been invited to observe the family's most important annual event, and I understood this was an honor in the vocabulary Victoria used, not a warmth. It was an audition in the form of a dinner. Victoria cooked nothing. She organized everything, which she presented as the harder and more sophisticated contribution. The caterers arrived at noon. Victoria supervised. She wore a dress that cost more than my monthly rent. She received her family with the specific warmth of a woman who wanted to be admired for her warmth, rather than actually warm. I brought a pie. My mother's recipe, bourbon pecan. I had made it the day before in my apartment in Atlanta and transported it in the back seat of my car as carefully as I had transported anything in my life. Victoria accepted it at the door with both hands and a smile that said how quaint and moved immediately to a conversation about the renovation David was planning for the living room. The pie appeared on a side table in the kitchen, separate from the catered desserts, where I found it untouched at the end of the evening. I drove home with my pecan pie and I told myself that Victoria was a difficult woman and that difficult women were manageable if you were patient, and that David was worth the patience. I took the pie to work the following Monday. My colleagues ate it completely in 20 minutes and 3 of them asked for the recipe. I gave them the recipe and I thought about Victoria's side table and I noted the information and I moved on. That is how the 30 years went. Event by event. Each one a small accumulation of information that I noted and filed and moved past because I had decided that moving past was what the marriage required. Victoria never ate anything I brought to that table. In 30 years, not once. If she could not claim credit for it, she did not acknowledge it. The food I cooked for her own son's dinners became, in her telling, the food that had been prepared for the occasion. Passive voice, no author. She complimented her own kitchen for the results, and the kitchen accepted the compliment on behalf of the woman who had spent 6 hours in it. David did not correct this. In 30 years, David did not once say, actually, Carolyn made that, or Carolyn spent the afternoon on this. He ate the food and he thanked me privately, and he allowed his mother to absorb the credit publicly, and when I mentioned it, he said it wasn't worth making a thing of it. By the time I found the emails, I had a very precise accounting of what was and was not worth making a thing of in the Merritt family. It was a very short list. It turned out that 30 years of accumulated information had produced a very clear picture. I had just been choosing not to look at the picture directly. The emails gave me permission to look directly. That is what I mean when I say the emails gave me clarity. Not the content specifically. The permission to see what I had been accumulating evidence for 30 years. I did not know the full truth about Victoria's finances until Patricia's investigation uncovered it. But I had known for years that something about the Merritt family's money did not add up in the way that things add up when they are what they claim to be. Small things. The house in Buckhead had not been repainted in a decade, but Victoria spoke of having it painted every spring. The club membership that she mentioned constantly was actually in David's name on the billing, which I had seen once when a statement came to our house by mistake. The charitable contributions she mentioned at dinner were spoken of but not evidenced, in the way that people who actually make large charitable contributions eventually evidence them. The summer trip to Europe that she described planning every January had not happened in the 5 years before Thanksgiving. None of these things individually constituted evidence of anything, but they were inconsistencies of the kind that accumulate in a person's notes when a person pays attention. I had been paying attention. I had been paying attention for 30 years, and the notes were extensive. Patricia's investigation confirmed what the notes suggested. The Merritt family fortune had been declining since the early 2000s, a series of real estate investments that had not performed as expected. A lawsuit from a former business partner that had been settled for a figure the family had not disclosed, the credit arrangements that sustained the appearance of wealth, the club membership that was technically current because David paid it and David did not know that she could not. Victoria had built her entire social identity on a foundation that she knew was crumbling. Every event, every dinner, every Thanksgiving was a performance designed to obscure the crumbling. And every year that Caroline sat at that table and allowed herself to be condescended to by a woman who was performing solvency on borrowed money was a year that the performance continued. The emails about my inheritance were the logical extension of a woman who had been performing for decades and who had identified a resource that could end the performance and replace it with reality. My father's estate was the solution to Victoria's problem. The solution required my signature on documents that I had not been told the truth about. I did not sign those documents. I did not sign them because I found the emails before the documents arrived. I found the emails because David left his tablet on his desk on a September afternoon, and I was looking for a utility bill. Fortune, as Harold used to say, favors the person who is paying attention. I was paying attention. Patricia Crane had been practicing estate and family law in Atlanta for 22 years when I walked into her office in September. She was 53 years old and she had the particular manner of a woman who has heard every version of every family situation that money can create and who retains the capacity to be interested in each new version without being surprised by any of them. She read the emails I showed her with complete attention and no visible reaction. When she had finished, she set the tablet down on her desk and she looked at me and she said, "You have married a very foolish man." I said, "I am aware." She said, "I want to understand the timeline." She said, "When were these emails sent?" I told her. She said, "And you have not signed any documents." I said I had not. She said, "And your father's estate is currently—" I told her where it was. She said that was fine. That was manageable. We needed to move quickly on certain things, but we had the situation in hand. She spent the next 45 minutes asking me questions and taking notes. At the end she looked at what she had written and she said, "What outcome are you looking for?" I told her. She said, "All right," and she picked up her pen and she started making a list. Patricia is meticulous. She is also, which I had not known when I came in, and which I was glad to discover, possessed of a dry sense of the appropriate. When I told her about my plan for the Thanksgiving dinner, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I cannot advise you to do this." Then she said, "If you are going to do it anyway, I want to make sure that everything in those folders is properly authenticated, and that there is nothing in them that you cannot defend." We spent 3 more weeks making sure everything in the folders was properly authenticated and that there was nothing in them I could not defend. On the Monday after Thanksgiving, she filed the petition and the complaint and the notifications to the relevant parties, and she did it with the particular efficiency of someone who had been ready for some time. I think Patricia enjoyed Monday morning. I think it was the kind of Monday morning that makes someone glad they became an attorney. I have thought carefully about how to describe David in this telling because he is the central figure in what happened and the description needs to be accurate. He was not cruel. I want to say that first because cruelty is the easy explanation, and it is not the right one. He was not a man who enjoyed my suffering or who intended me harm in any direct sense. He was a man who had been raised by a woman who required total loyalty and who had learned over 50 years that the loyalty required sacrifice and that the sacrifice was acceptable because the loyalty was the primary relationship and everything else was secondary. I was secondary. I had always been secondary to Victoria in David's internal ranking. Not because he did not love me. Because the love for Victoria was foundational in a way that my love was not and could not be. No matter what I did, because I had arrived after the foundation was laid and the foundation was not going to be rebuilt to accommodate me. He was also, I now understand, frightened of her. Not in a simple way. In the deep and complicated way of a person who has been shaped by someone's approval and disapproval for 50 years and for whom the approval is still the thing that determines the quality of their interior experience. Victoria's disappointment was existential to David in a way that mine was not and could not be. This did not excuse what he did. It explained it. The emails did not surprise me in their tone. They surprised me in their specificity. I had known David deferred to Victoria. I had known for 30 years that his loyalty to her outweighed his loyalty to me. What I had not known was that the deferral extended to active deception, that he would not merely fail to protect me from her, but would participate with her in something that required treating me as a target rather than a person. She doesn't suspect anything. I'll have the documents ready by October. He wrote that about his wife of 30 years. About the woman he kissed at the door when he left for site visits, and who had made his dinner and built his house into a home, and who had sat at his mother's table for 30 years with patience and grace. She doesn't suspect anything. I think about that sentence sometimes, not with bitterness, with the specific interest of a woman who has learned something true about the limits of what love can be when it is housed inside a character that was not built to hold it properly. He loved me. He wrote that sentence anyway. Both things were true. Both things were him. I have been to the land 4 times since the divorce. Each time I stay a little longer. It is 32 acres outside Knoxville. Some of it is cleared. Most of it is wooded. The creek runs through the lower portion, and in the spring there are wildflowers along the bank that I had not expected when I first saw it. Harold had not told me about the wildflowers. He was not a man who led with beauty. He led with the practical, and let the beautiful be discovered. I found the wildflowers on my second visit in April. I stood at the edge of the creek in the morning light, and I looked at them, and I thought about Harold and about how he had owned this land for years, and had walked it every spring, and had known about the wildflowers and had never mentioned them because they were simply part of what the land was, and what the land was did not require advertising. He was like that. He did not advertise what he was. He was what he was, and he let people discover it or not, and he was not diminished by being undiscovered. Victoria had spent 30 years advertising what she was not. The difference between those two approaches to the world is the difference between a foundation and a performance, and I had confused the performance for a foundation for 30 years because the performance was very good and because I had wanted to believe the best of the family I had married into. I know the difference now. I am standing on Harold's land in the spring with wildflowers along the creek. This is a foundation. This is something that was here before I arrived, and that will be here after I am gone, and that does not require my belief in order to exist. I am going to build something on this land. I do not know exactly what yet. Patricia says there is no hurry, and I am taking her advice and Harold's and my own. I am taking my time. I am looking at the land in each season and understanding what it wants to be and what I want to do with it. The decision will come. It will be mine when it comes. Nobody will put their hand on my arm to indicate that I should make it faster. I think about what Harold would say about all of this. Not about the Thanksgiving. He would have something dry and precise to say about the Thanksgiving, but I cannot quite hear the words because I did not know, when he was alive, that the Thanksgiving was coming. I can hear him more clearly on the larger things. He would say that you cannot live inside someone else's story about you. He said something like this to me once when I was a teenager and had been told by a girl at school that I was not interesting. He said that girl has told you her story about you. He said you are under no obligation to live in it. I lived in Victoria's story about me for 30 years. Not entirely, but enough. I let her story occupy space in the room that should have been occupied by my own. I polished my behavior and contained my opinions and managed my presence in a way that was shaped by her assessment of my inadequacy, rather than by my own understanding of my value. I am not living in that story anymore. Harold would also say something about the land. He would probably say you'll figure out what it wants to be when you stop thinking about what you want it to be and start looking at what it is. That was how he worked. He looked at things a long time before he decided anything. He said deciding to fast was how you ended up with someone else's decision instead of your own. I am looking at the land, and I am looking at this chapter of my life, and I am not deciding to fast. I have time. The land has time. The wildflowers will come back in the spring, regardless of what I decide. Harold would approve of the patience. He would probably not approve of the Thanksgiving. He was a very quiet man who believed in handling things with minimal spectacle. He would have done it differently. But then, he had not spent 30 years at that table. I had, and I handled it the way 30 years at that table had prepared me to handle it, which was with complete honesty in front of the complete audience and the specific satisfaction of a woman who has finally said the true thing out loud in the room that needed to hear it. Harold would have found it excessive. He also would have laughed. He would have tried not to, and he would not have succeeded, and eventually he would have said, "That does sound like something your mother would have done," and meant it as the highest possible compliment, because my mother, God rest her, had also been a woman who knew exactly when to say the true thing out loud. I am their daughter. I did what they raised me to do. That is the whole story. That is everything. My name is Carolyn Merritt. My father's name was Harold. He left me land with wildflowers along the creek and the understanding that what is mine, and that I was under no obligation to live in someone else's story about me. I am not living in it. I am standing in the spring light with wildflowers at my feet, on land my father left me. That is enough. That is everything. That is the whole story. I stayed in a hotel in Buckhead that night. Not because I had nowhere to go, because I did not want to go back to the house yet, and the hotel was clean and quiet and had room service, and I ordered soup and I ate it sitting in bed watching the city lights, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a person who had done the thing she intended to do and was living in the aftermath of it. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. I had imagined many versions of the hours after the Thanksgiving. In some versions I felt triumph. In some versions I felt grief. In some I felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent 30 years holding something in and has finally released it. What I felt was simpler than any of those. I felt accurate. Like a measurement that had come out right. Not dramatically right. Just right. I ate my soup. I turned off the lights. I slept better than I had in months. In the morning I ordered coffee, and I sat at the window and I looked out over Buckhead in the November light. Somewhere across those streets, Victoria was waking up in her federal-style house that she could not actually afford. David was waking up in our house. The attorneys and the cousins and the family friends were waking up and opening their phones and finding whatever had already been said about the previous evening. None of it was my concern anymore. The documents were in their hands. Patricia's office would handle Monday. Everything that needed doing was in the right hands. I called Patricia at 9. She said she had already received 2 calls, and that the situation was proceeding exactly as anticipated. She said my attorney should call her attorney, and that she would handle it from there. I said good. She said enjoy your weekend, Caroline. I said I intend to. I drove to Knoxville that afternoon. Not to the apartment. To the land. I pulled off the road at the gate and I got out of the car and I walked the path along the creek in the November cold. No wildflowers in November. The trees were bare. The creek was running high from recent rain. The land looked like land does in late autumn, stark and truthful and not concerned with being beautiful for an audience. I stood at the edge of the creek for a while. I thought about Harold. About Thanksgivings with Harold, which had been modest and warm and had not required performance. About the way he said grace at those meals, which was brief and specific and never asked for things but only gave thanks for what was already present. He had a gift for noticing what was already present and naming it. I stood at the creek and I tried to notice what was present. The cold air, the sound of water, bare trees against a gray November sky. 31 acres of land in Tennessee that belonged to me and to no one else, and that would still be here in the spring when the wildflowers came back. I was present. Entirely, specifically, myself. Standing on ground that was mine. That was what was present. I named it the way Harold would have named it. Quietly, accurately, without requiring it to be more than it was. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. I heard from 2 of David's cousins in the weeks after Thanksgiving. Not formally. Through the informal channels of a family that had just had something happen to it that it did not have a precedent for, and was trying to understand what it meant. The first was a woman named Gail who had been at the dinner and who had always been, in my experience of her, one of the more honest members of the Merritt family. She texted me 2 days after Thanksgiving. The text said, I read the whole folder. I want you to know I believe it. I want you to know some of us knew something was off, but we never had anything to point to. I am sorry it took this long and I am sorry you had to do it the way you did it. I texted back, thank you, I am not sorry I did it the way I did it. She responded with a single word, good. The second was a man named Philip, who had been David's closest cousin growing up, and who had not been at Thanksgiving because he lived in Denver and had his own family there, and had not made the trip. He called me about 2 weeks later. He said he had heard about what happened and he had called David and David had given him one version and he wanted to hear another. I said I was happy to give him one and I was brief and specific and I did not editorialized, and at the end of it he was quiet for a moment and he said, I always thought David let his mother run too much of his life. I said yes. He said I am sorry you spent 30 years in that situation. I said I made my own choices and they were mine to make. He said that is a generous way to look at it. I said it is also the accurate way. We talked for another 20 minutes about other things, about his children, and my plans and the land in Knoxville. He said he had been to Tennessee once and that it was beautiful. I said it was. He said he hoped things went well for me going forward. I said I expected they would. He still calls sometimes. Not often. But occasionally. He is a decent person in the way that a few people in every family are decent people, genuinely and quietly, and without requiring it to be noticed. I appreciate that quality now more than I did before. I have learned to notice it more reliably. I have described what happened at the Thanksgiving table, but I have not described what it felt like from the inside, and I think that belongs in this telling. Standing up at that table was the most frightening thing I have done in my adult life. Not because of what was about to happen, because of what I was leaving. 30 years of being the person who did not make scenes. 30 years of being the person who swallowed things and kept going, and believed that steadiness was its own form of integrity. Standing up at that table was the moment I stopped being that person, and I did not know yet who I was going to be instead. The terror of the moment was not about Victoria. It was not about David, or the room, or the 30 pairs of eyes. It was about me, about the person I had been for 30 years, and whether I could leave her at the table, and walk out the door. I stood up. I hit the champagne glass with the spoon. The sound rang out, and the room quieted, and I felt the terror, and I stood through it, and I began to speak. By the time I started reading from the folder, the terror was gone. Not because it had resolved, because the words required all of my attention, and the words left no room for the terror. I was reading clearly and at the right volume, and the room was hearing me, and the words were true, and the only thing that mattered in that moment was continuing to say them accurately. That is what it felt like. Like the 30 years of practice at that table had produced exactly the skills required for this moment. The patience and the pleasantness and the capacity to be entirely present in a room that would have preferred I were less present. All of it landed in one evening, and what it produced was a woman standing at a Thanksgiving table, reading the truth out loud in a voice that did not shake. I did not shake. In 30 years I had learned not to shake. I had learned it for the wrong reasons, and I used it at the right moment, and the ground held. After I walked out the door and the cold air hit my face, I stood on the step for a moment. My heart was doing something that was not exactly fear and not exactly exhilaration, but was in the general neighborhood of both. I breathed. The valet was already coming with my car. I got in, I drove. The long driveway lined with trees, and then the road, and then Atlanta, and then the hotel, and then soup in bed, and then sleep. In the morning I felt accurate, like a measurement that had come out right. That is the only word that fits. Accurate. Finally, after 30 years, completely accurate. My name is Caroline Merritt. I stood at a table and read the truth out loud, and I did not shake. My father would not have done it this way. He would have been right about that. He also raised me to see clearly, and to say what I see, and what I saw required saying in a room that needed to hear it. I said it. That is the whole story. That is everything. That is all of it. I want to tell you about the pecan pie because it is the image I return to most often when I think about 30 years at that table. The first Thanksgiving I brought a bourbon pecan pie. I have told you that. What I have not told you is that I made the same pie every Thanksgiving for the next 29 years. Every year I made it the day before in my kitchen and transported it carefully in the back seat of my car, and every year, Victoria accepted it with the same smile that said how quaint, and every year I found it, untouched at the end of the evening, on whatever side table or kitchen counter it had been displaced to by the caterers. I brought the pie anyway. Every year, not because I was oblivious. I knew she did not eat it. I knew she did not acknowledge it. I brought it because it was my mother's recipe, and because it was good, and because the act of bringing something made from my own hands to the table, where I sat every year, was an assertion, quiet and annual, that I existed in that room as a person, and not simply as a presence management problem. Nobody knew I was making that assertion. That was fine. Assertions do not require witnesses to be real. The 30th Thanksgiving I did not bring a pie. I brought the red folders. It was a different kind of bringing something made from my own hands to that table. 30 folders instead of one pie. Made with 6 weeks of work instead of an afternoon in the kitchen. The substance was different. The assertion was the same. I exist in this room as a person. This is something I made. Look at it. They looked at it. Harold loved that pie. Every year after Thanksgiving he would ask if there was any left, and I would say no, and he would say of course not, and he would be genuinely disappointed, in the specific way of a man who finds good food a genuine pleasure rather than a social signal. He said once that it was the best pecan pie he had ever eaten. I said that was because it was his mother's recipe. He said no, his mother made it differently. He said you make it with your own hands, and that is what makes it better. I think about that when I think about the pie at Victoria's table. What Harold said about making something with your own hands. How the making is what makes it better. The folders I made with my own hands. The emails were true, and the documents were real, and the ribbons were red, and I assembled them with care, and I brought them to the table where I had been sitting for 30 years, and I put them in 30 pairs of hands that needed to hold them. That is something I made. With my own hands. Out of what I found, I think Harold would have found it excessive. I also think he would have admired the craft. He had a great respect for craft, for making something well out of the materials at hand, for not wasting what you have found. I did not waste what I found. I have been in Knoxville for 8 months, long enough to know the neighborhood, long enough to have a coffee place where the person behind the counter knows my order. long enough to have walked the land in 3 seasons, and to understand what it needs in each one. I have also been in Knoxville long enough to start to understand who I am when I am not managing someone else's version of me. That turns out to be interesting. The person who emerges when you stop spending energy on management is not who you expected. She has opinions she did not know she had. She has interests she had set aside decades ago because they did not fit the shape of the life she was in. She has a preference for silence that she had not been able to honor in a house that required constant vigilance. I like silence now. I like mornings that belong entirely to me. I like the coffee in the kitchen with the window open in the spring, and the creek on the land and the wildflowers along the bank, and the specific absence of anyone requiring anything of me in the first hours of the day. This is probably something that takes a long time to earn. 30 years, maybe. The 30 years of that table were not wasted. They produced this, among other things. The ability to fully inhabit a morning that is mine. To sit with coffee and not manage anything, and to find that the not managing is not lonely, but spacious. To understand that the space is mine, and that I have earned the right to fill it with exactly what I choose. I am filling it slowly, not rushing. Harold's advice, which is the best advice: take your time with the things that matter. Because the decisions made in a hurry belong to the hurry and not to you. The land is going to be something in the spring. I have been talking to a woman who does environmental restoration work, and who has some ideas about the creek and the woodland edge, and the meadow area in the upper section. We have walked it together twice. She is the kind of person who looks at land the way Harold looked at it, long and without rushing, trying to understand what it wants to be. I am learning to do that. To look long at things before I decide. I have a lot of time now. The patience I spent 30 years applying to the wrong situation has not gone anywhere. It is here. It is mine. I am applying it to things that deserve it. My name is Caroline Merritt. My father's name was Harold. He raised me to see clearly, and to say what I see, and to take my time with the decisions that matter, and to make things with my own hands. I made 30 red folders with my own hands, and I put them on a Thanksgiving table, and I read the truth out loud in a voice that did not shake. Then I drove to Knoxville. Then I stood at the edge of a creek in November. Then I ate soup in a hotel bed and slept. In the spring the wildflowers came back along the creek. They will come back again next spring, and the spring after that. The land does not care who sat at Victoria's table for 30 years. The land just does what it does in each season. I am going to do what I do in each season too. I am going to tend what is mine, and build what deserves to be built, and say the true thing when the true thing needs to be said. That is the life. That is the whole of it. That is everything. At the Thanksgiving table, there was a woman named Betsy, who I mentioned briefly, and who deserves more than a brief mention. Betsy Hargrove had been married to David's family attorney for 12 years. She was 51, originally from Nashville. With a directness that I had noticed from the first dinner I met her at. She was the only person in the Merritt social circle who had ever asked me, with genuine curiosity, what I did with my time. Not what my husband did. What I did. She had listened to the answer with real interest, and had followed up the next time I saw her with questions about specific things I had mentioned. In a world where most people at Victoria's table treated me as an extension of David rather than an individual, Betsy had always treated me as a person. I had appreciated this without fully articulating it. At the Thanksgiving, she was the first person to open her folder. I have told you that. What I have not told you is what she did after she read the first page. She looked up from the folder and she looked at me and she said, "Caroline." Just my name. In a tone that contained about 6 things simultaneously. Recognition and surprise, and something that was very close to satisfaction, and something that was also grief. Grief for 30 years of watching something happen to a person and not having the full picture of it until now. I nodded at her. She nodded back. Then she kept reading. After I walked out, I received a text from Betsy about 40 minutes later. It said, "Well done." It said we should have lunch. It said, "I am sorry it took this long, and I am glad it happened." We had lunch 3 weeks later, in a restaurant in Buckhead that was not in Victoria's orbit. We talked for 2 hours. She told me things she had observed over the years at those tables that she had not known what to do with, and that now made a complete and infuriating sense. I told her things I had stored in the notes of 30 years of paying attention. We shared the picture between us, and it was the same picture, and it was a relief to have someone else look at it clearly. She has become a genuine friend. Not a friend of the marriage, or a friend of the social arrangement, or a friend of the table. A friend of mine. One of the few I have made in Atlanta who I am keeping. She asked me once what I would do differently. Not about the Thanksgiving. About the 30 years. I told her I would not have let it go so many times. I said not letting it go earlier would have changed things in ways I cannot fully map, but that the accumulation of letting it go had its own cost, and that cost was real. She said she thought that was probably right. She said she thought there was a particular cost to the long patience that did not get talked about enough. She said people talked about the courage of the final act, but not about what the long patience cost. I said I was talking about it now. She said yes. She said she was glad someone was. I am talking about it now. It costs something. The 30 years of polite patience cost something specific and real. The patience was not wrong exactly. The application of it was, I applied it to the wrong situation for the wrong reasons, and the cost accumulated in ways I am still accounting for. The accounting is mine to do. I am doing it. Slowly. On the land, and in the mornings with the coffee, and in the conversations with Betsy, and in this telling. That is the whole accounting. That is the whole story. That is everything. My name is Caroline Merritt. The truth was in 30 red folders. I put them on the table. I read from them in a voice that did not shake. Then I drove to Knoxville. The wildflowers are coming in the spring. That is enough. That is everything.